The rain fell in thick sheets against the glass tower of Hartwell Industries, a 40-story monument to wealth and ambition that pierced the Seattle skyline like a steel needle. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed with cold efficiency, illuminating rows of cubicles where people hunched over keyboards, their lives measured in quarterly reports and performance reviews. Emma Reyes sat at her desk on the 23rd floor, her fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced precision. She was 32 years old, though worry had etched premature lines around her eyes, lines that spoke of sleepless nights and silent prayers whispered in the dark. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a navy cardigan that had seen better days, its cuffs slightly frayed from years of wear. She kept a photograph tucked in the corner of her desk, partially hidden behind her computer monitor. In it, a boy of 7 smiled with gap-toothed joy, his dark eyes bright with innocence. Mateo. Her entire world condensed into 3 feet of boundless energy and questions that never stopped. "Still at it, Emma?" The voice came from behind her, dripping with a condescension she'd learned to recognize instantly. She didn't turn around. "Just finishing the quarterly projections, Mr. Hartwell." Dominic Hartwell circled her desk like a predator assessing prey. At 38, he wore his wealth like armor, the tailored suit that cost more than Emma made in 3 months, the Swiss watch that caught the light with each dismissive gesture, the cologne that announced his presence before he entered a room. His dark hair was swept back perfectly, his jaw sharp enough to cut glass, his blue eyes cold with an arrogance that had been bred into him across generations of old money and older power. "Projections," he repeated, his lips curving into a smile that never reached his eyes. "Tell me, Emma, do you even understand what these numbers mean? Or are you just copying formulas like a trained monkey?" The other employees kept their heads down, their silence complicit. This was theater they'd witnessed before. Dominic's favorite sport, finding the weakest target and dismantling them piece by piece in front of an audience too afraid to intervene. Emma's hands stilled on the keyboard. She could feel her pulse in her throat, the familiar heat of humiliation rising to her cheeks. But she'd learned long ago that responding only gave him more ammunition. "I understand them perfectly, Mr. Hartwell. The projections show a 12% increase in—" "Save it." He waved his hand dismissively. "I don't need financial lessons from someone who shops at thrift stores." His eyes traveled over her worn cardigan with theatrical disgust. "Tell me, do they sell ambition there? Or just desperation?" Someone laughed, a nervous, sycophantic sound that made Emma's stomach turn. She thought of Mateo, waiting for her at after-school care, probably drawing another picture of the 2 of them holding hands under a smiling sun. She thought of the rent due in 3 days, the medical bills from his last asthma attack still sitting unpaid on her kitchen counter, the scholarship application she'd been filling out late at night for a school that might give him opportunities she never had. "No, sir," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "They don't." Dominic leaned against her cubicle wall, enjoying his performance. "You know what I find fascinating? How people like you stumble into places like this. This isn't a charity, Emma. We don't hand out participation trophies. We reward excellence, vision, hunger." He straightened his cuffs with deliberate slowness. "But I suppose when you're busy juggling food stamps and daycare schedules, excellence becomes negotiable." The words hung in the air like poison. Emma felt something crack inside her, not breaking completely, but fracturing in a way that would leave a permanent scar. She'd endured his cruelty for 18 months, ever since she'd been hired as a junior analyst. She'd told herself it was temporary, that she just needed to survive long enough to build her resume, to save enough money to give Matteo a better life. But in that moment, staring at the photograph of her son, partially hidden behind her monitor, she wondered how much of her soul she was willing to sacrifice on the altar of survival. "Is there anything else, Mr. Hartwell?" Her voice came out harder than she intended, edged with something that surprised them both. His eyes narrowed. For a moment, she saw something flicker behind the polished mask. A flash of recognition, perhaps, or memory. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Just get the projections to me by end of day." He turned to leave, then paused, delivering his parting shot over his shoulder. "And Emma? Try not to look so tragic. It's bad for morale." He walked away, his expensive shoes clicking against the polished floor, leaving behind the wreckage of her dignity and the whispers of her co-workers who'd watched the whole spectacle unfold. Emma sat frozen for a long moment, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Outside, the rain continued its relentless assault on the windows, each drop a tiny explosion against the glass. She thought about her grandmother, who'd raised her after her mother disappeared when Emma was 12, who'd taught her that survival wasn't just about enduring, it was about maintaining your humanity in a world designed to strip it away. But her grandmother was gone now, 3 years buried in a cemetery in Tacoma, her wisdom reduced to memories that Emma clung to like lifelines in the dark. She glanced at Matteo's photograph again, at that smile that could light up her darkest days, at those eyes that looked at her like she was magic personified. He didn't know yet how cruel the world could be. He didn't know that his father— Emma stopped that thought before it could fully form. Some truths were too heavy to bear in fluorescent light, under the gaze of co-workers who'd rather look away than offer solidarity. She returned to her projections, her fingers finding their rhythm again. The numbers blurred slightly, whether from tears or exhaustion, she couldn't tell. But she kept working because that's what she did. She survived. She endured. She woke up every morning and put one foot in front of the other, carrying the weight of 2 lives on shoulders that sometimes felt too fragile to bear the load. Somewhere high above, in a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city like a throne room, Dominic Hartwell stood staring at the rain-soaked streets below. His reflection gazed back at him from the glass, handsome, powerful, untouchable. He'd built his reputation on being ruthless, on never showing weakness, on believing that compassion was just another word for failure. But sometimes, in the quiet moments between victories, he felt the weight of something he couldn't name, a hollowness that no acquisition could fill, no conquest could satisfy. It gnawed at him in the early hours of morning when sleep wouldn't come, when the silence of his penthouse apartment felt less like luxury and more like exile. He pushed the feeling away, as he always did. Weakness was a luxury he couldn't afford, not in this world, not with the legacy he was building, not with the empire his father had left him to expand and defend. He didn't think about the woman on the 23rd floor, or the pain that had flickered across her face when he'd struck her with his words. He didn't think about how her eyes had reminded him, just for a heartbeat, of another woman's eyes from another lifetime ago. Dark and deep, and full of a sadness he'd been too young and too arrogant to understand. He didn't think about any of it, because Dominic Hartwell had trained himself not to look back. The past was dead, and he intended to keep it that way. The after-school program occupied a converted church basement in the Rainier Valley neighborhood, its walls painted in cheerful primary colors that tried to disguise the water stains creeping across the ceiling tiles. Children's artwork covered every available surface, drawings of families and pets, and dreams rendered in crayon and marker, each one a small rebellion against the poverty that defined this part of the city. Emma arrived at 10 minutes past 6, breathless from running 3 blocks from the bus stop. Ms. Chen, the program director, looked up from her desk with the patient expression of someone who'd watched single mothers race against time for 30 years. "Mateo's in the reading corner," she said gently, not mentioning that Emma was late again, that she was the last parent to arrive for the 3rd time this week. Emma found him curled up with a book, his small body folded into a beanbag chair that had seen better decades. He was reading with fierce concentration, his lips moving slightly as he sounded out the harder words. His sneakers, bought second-hand but cleaned with care, swung back and forth in unconscious rhythm. "Hey, baby," Emma said softly, crouching beside him. Mateo looked up, and his face transformed with joy so pure it made Emma's chest ache. "Mom, I finished the whole chapter, Ms. Chen said I'm reading at a 4th grade level, and I'm only in 2nd grade." She pulled him into a hug, breathing in the smell of his shampoo and the faint scent of the cafeteria lunch that still clung to his jacket. This moment, right here, this was why she endured Dominic Hartwell's cruelty, why she swallowed her pride and accepted being treated like she was disposable. Because Mateo deserved a mother who showed up, even when showing up meant sacrificing pieces of herself she wasn't sure she'd ever get back. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered into his hair. "So proud." They took the bus home as the city darkened around them, Mateo chattering about his day while Emma held his hand and tried to push away the afternoon's humiliation. Their apartment was in a complex that had been luxury living in the 1970s, but had since descended through decades of neglect into tired functionality. The hallway smelled like cooking grease and disappointment. Their unit was small, a 1-bedroom where Emma slept on the couch and Mateo had the bedroom to himself. But Emma had made it warm, filling it with second-hand furniture she'd refinished, with plants she'd coaxed into life on the windowsill, with the kind of love that couldn't be bought or faked. While Mateo did his homework at the kitchen table, Emma made dinner, pasta with marinara sauce and frozen vegetables, the kind of meal she could stretch across 3 nights if she was careful. She watched him work, his tongue poking out slightly in concentration, his handwriting careful and deliberate. He had his father's eyes. That was the thought that ambushed her when she least expected it, the truth that waited in the quiet moments between action and rest. Those same dark blue eyes that had looked at her with such intensity 9 years ago, before everything fell apart. "Mom?" Mateo's voice pulled her back to the present. "Why are you staring at me funny?" Emma smiled, shaking her head. "Just thinking about how smart you are. Smartest kid I know." That's what Grandma always said, Matteo replied, returning to his work. I wish I remembered her better. She loved you so much, Emma said, her voice tight with the grief that never fully departed. Every day, she'd tell me how special you were, how you were going to do amazing things. They ate dinner together at the small table, Emma listening to Matteo's plans to become a marine biologist, or maybe an astronaut, or possibly both. Because why should he have to choose? His dreams were vast and beautiful, untainted yet by the reality of limited resources and closed doors. After she'd tucked him into bed, reading him 2 chapters from his current favorite book about a boy who could talk to dolphins, Emma sat on the couch in the dark apartment and allowed herself 5 minutes to feel the weight of everything. The bills were spread across the coffee table, medical expenses, rent notices, credit card statements that made her stomach clench. She'd been so careful, so disciplined, but Matteo's asthma medication was expensive even with insurance, and the car had needed repairs last month, and the universe seemed determined to extract payment for her mistakes in the most relentless way possible. Her phone buzzed with a text from her friend Janelle, who worked in HR at Hartwell Industries. Girl, are you okay? Heard what happened today. That man is trash. Emma stared at the message, unsure how to respond. What could she say? That she was fine? That it didn't hurt to be systematically destroyed by someone who'd once whispered poetry against her skin, who'd promised her forever in the back of his car on a beach in Malibu when they were both too young to understand what forever meant? She typed back, I'm good, just tired. 3 dots appeared then. You deserve better than this. Than him. Emma locked her phone without responding. Deserve. As if the universe operated on some grand system of justice, as if good people automatically got good things and suffering was reserved for those who'd earned it through moral failing. She'd met Dominic Hartwell 9 years ago at a summer party in Los Angeles, back when she was 23 and still believed that beauty and intelligence might be enough to transcend the barriers of class and expectation. He'd been visiting from Seattle, taking a break from his MBA program, carrying himself with the easy confidence of someone who'd never had to wonder if he belonged in any space he occupied. They'd talked for hours on the beach while the party raged behind them, about philosophy and art and the nature of consciousness. He'd seemed different then, or maybe she'd just been naive enough to believe that the right person could make all the barriers disappear. Their summer romance had burned hot and fast, conducted in secret because he'd said his family wouldn't understand, that he needed to establish himself first before he could challenge their expectations. Emma had believed him because she'd wanted to, because at 23 she still thought love could conquer the architecture of privilege and power. When she'd discovered she was pregnant 6 weeks after he'd returned to Seattle, she'd called him with trembling hands and a heart full of terrified hope. His voice on the other end of the line had been cold, surgical in its precision. This isn't a good time for me. I'm in the middle of my MBA. My family has plans. I'll send you money for it. For what? She'd asked, even though she already knew. To take care of it, he'd said, as if Matteo were a problem to be solved rather than a life waiting to unfold. She'd hung up, and he'd never called back. The money had arrived, $10,000 wired to her account, with no note, no message, just a cold transaction that communicated everything about how he viewed her and the child she carried. Emma had kept the baby and kept the secret. She'd moved back to Seattle 3 years ago, driven by some inexplicable instinct to be closer to Mateo's heritage, even if he'd never acknowledge it. She'd taken the job at Hartwell Industries under her mother's maiden name, Reyes instead of Santos, believing that 18 months in a company of 3,000 employees meant she could hide in plain sight. But Dominic didn't recognize her. The girl he'd romanced on that beach had been younger, thinner, her hair longer, and highlighted in ways she could no longer afford. Time and hardship had carved her into someone different, someone he looked through rather than at. Sometimes she wondered if she should tell him, if she should let Mateo know that the man who mocked his mother in corporate corridors was the same man whose DNA he carried, whose eyes looked back at him from the mirror every morning. But what would that accomplish besides dragging her son into a war he hadn't asked to fight? Dominic had made his choice 9 years ago. He'd chosen his empire over their child, his reputation over their love, his future over their past. Emma couldn't give him the chance to reject Mateo the way he'd rejected her. Outside her window, Seattle sprawled in all its complexity. The gleaming towers downtown where Dominic lived in his penthouse, the middle-class neighborhoods clinging to hillsides, and the struggling communities like hers where people worked 3 jobs and still couldn't climb out of the hole that poverty dug beneath their feet. Somewhere in that vast city, in an office she'd never see, Dominic was probably still working, building his fortune one cold calculation at a time, never suspecting that the woman he'd humiliated today carried the secret of his son like a time bomb waiting in the dark. Emma closed her eyes and thought about her grandmother's favorite saying, "The truth has its own timeline. You can't force it, mija, but you can't hide from it either." She just hoped that when the truth finally arrived, it wouldn't destroy them all. 3 weeks later, the carefully constructed walls between Emma's past and present began to crumble. It started with something small, a forgotten permission slip for Mateo's field trip that Emma discovered at 7:30 in the morning, sitting on the kitchen counter where she'd meant to sign it the night before. She'd been so exhausted after working late on a presentation that she'd collapsed into sleep without her usual evening checklist. "Mom, I need that today," Mateo said, anxiety creeping into his voice. "If you don't sign it, I can't go to the science museum." Emma looked at the clock, calculating rapidly. If she left immediately, she could drop him at school, race back home for the form, return to his school before the bus left at 9, and still make it to work by 9:30. She'd be late, which would mean another mark against her in a file that was probably already thick with minor infractions. But Mateo came first. He always came first. "Get your backpack, baby. We'll make it work." But the bus was delayed, and then there was an accident on Aurora Avenue that turned traffic into a parking lot. And by the time Emma burst into Hartwell Industries at 10:15, her hair disheveled and her breath coming in gasps, she knew she'd crossed a line. Margaret from HR intercepted her at the elevator. "Emma, Mr. Hartwell wants to see you. Immediately." The walk to his office felt like a death march. Other employees watched with a mixture of pity and relief, grateful it was her instead of them. The executive floor was everything the lower levels weren't. Polished marble, original artwork, floor-to-ceiling windows that made you feel like you were walking among clouds. Dominic's assistant gestured toward his office without making eye contact. Emma knocked once, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Enter!" His office was designed to intimidate. Vast, minimalist, dominated by a desk that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of obsidian. Behind it, Dominic sat like a king holding court, his suit immaculate, his expression cold. "Close the door," he said without looking up from his computer. Emma obeyed, standing in front of his desk like a student called to the principal's office. "This is the 4th time you've been late in 6 weeks," he said, his voice devoid of inflection. "I've reviewed your file. Substandard performance reviews, frequent requests for schedule adjustments, leaving early for family emergencies." He made air quotes around the last phrase, his contempt barely concealed. "Mr. Hartwell, I can explain." "Can you?" He finally looked at her, and something in his gaze made her blood run cold. "Because, from where I'm sitting, you're taking advantage of this company's generosity. We gave you a chance despite your limited qualifications, and you've repaid us with mediocrity and excuses." The words struck like physical blows. Emma felt her hands trembling, her throat tight with rage and humiliation and exhaustion that went bone deep. "I'm a single mother," she said, the words coming out harder than she intended. "I'm doing the best I can with the resources I have." "My son needed me this morning. I made a choice." "Your son." Dominic leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting to something resembling amusement. "Tell me, Emma, whose responsibility is your son? Yours? Or should Hartwell Industries be expected to accommodate your poor life choices?" The room seemed to tilt. Emma felt something inside her snap, not breaking completely, but fracturing in a way that would alter everything that came after. "Poor life choices," she repeated slowly. "Is that what you call it? What else would you call single motherhood at?" He glanced at her file. 24? Let me guess. Got pregnant by some deadbeat who disappeared the moment reality set in? And now the rest of us are supposed to pick up the slack while you juggle daycare schedules and permission slips? Emma's vision blurred at the edges. She thought about Matteo, about the way his face lit up when she came home, about the drawings he made where the two of them were always holding hands, always smiling. She thought about the nights she'd stayed awake teaching herself advanced Excel because she was determined to be more than what people like Dominic expected from someone with her background. And she thought about that summer 9 years ago, about a man who'd held her like she was precious, who'd whispered about futures and possibilities, who'd disappeared the moment his comfort was threatened by the reality of consequence. "You don't know anything about my life," she said quietly, but her voice carried steel now. "You don't know what I've survived or what I've sacrificed or what my son means to me." You see people like me as disposable, as if poverty and struggle mean we're less human, less worthy of dignity. Dominic's jaw tightened. "This isn't about dignity, this is about performance, and yours is unacceptable." "Then fire me," Emma said, surprising them both. "If I'm such a burden, such a failure, then fire me and be done with it. But stop pretending this is about performance reviews. This is about power. You enjoy it, breaking people down, reminding them how far beneath you they are." For a long moment, they stared at each other across the expanse of his desk. Something flickered in Dominic's expression, a crack in the armor perhaps, or an echo of recognition that he immediately suppressed. Before he could respond, the door burst open. Matteo stood in the doorway, his small chest heaving from running, his backpack hanging off one shoulder. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face streaked with tears. Behind him, Margaret from HR looked horrified, trying to apologize, to explain how the boy had slipped past security. But Emma wasn't listening to Margaret. She was staring at her son, at the determination on his face, at the way he'd clearly run all the way from school because something had gone terribly wrong. "Matteo, is this him?" The boy's voice was high and thin, stretched taut with emotions a 7-year-old shouldn't have to carry. "Is this my father?" The question hung in the air like a bomb whose countdown had just reached 0. Emma felt the world stop spinning. In the terrible silence that followed, she watched Dominic's face transform, confusion giving way to shock giving way to something that looked almost like horror. Matteo walked further into the office, his small hand reaching into his backpack. He pulled out an envelope, crumpled from being carried in a child's bag, but still intact. He placed it on Dominic's desk with deliberate ceremony. "A man came to my school," Matteo said, his voice shaking but determined. "He said his name was Victor Hartwell. He said he was my grandfather. He gave me this and told me to bring it here." The boy's eyes, those unmistakable dark blue eyes, fixed on Dominic with an intensity that was devastating in its innocence. "He said I'm here to claim my inheritance." The envelope lay on Dominic's desk like evidence at a crime scene, its edges worn from a child's careless handling. For several seconds, nobody moved. Emma felt paralyzed, watching her carefully constructed world disintegrate in real time. Matteo stood between them, small and brave, and utterly unaware of the earthquake he'd triggered. Dominic's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the envelope. Emma recognized the handwriting on the front, elegant, precise, the product of expensive private schools and generations of practiced superiority. Victor Hartwell, Dominic's father. The patriarch of a dynasty built on shipping and real estate, a man who turned a regional fortune into a national empire. "How did you—" Dominic's voice came out strangled. He cleared his throat and tried again, his eyes moving from the envelope to Matteo's face, then to Emma's. The calculation was visible in his expression, the pieces clicking into place despite his resistance. "How did my father find you?" Emma couldn't speak. Her throat had closed around words that felt too big, too dangerous to release. Matteo looked back at her, uncertainty finally creeping into his determined expression. "Mom? Did I do something wrong?" The question broke her paralysis. Emma crossed the room in 3 quick steps and pulled Matteo against her, her hands shaking as they pressed against his small back. "No, baby, you didn't do anything wrong. You could never do anything wrong." Dominic opened the envelope with surgical precision, his movements controlled despite the chaos Emma could see building behind his eyes. He pulled out a single sheet of expensive stationery, his eyes scanning the contents. Whatever he read there drained the color from his face. "Get out," he said quietly, not looking up from the letter. "Mr. Hartwell." "I said get out." The words exploded from him with such force that Matteo flinched. Emma felt her son's arms tighten around her waist, felt his face press against her stomach in instinctive protection. "Don't you dare yell in front of him," Emma said, her voice low and dangerous. "Whatever this is, whatever you're feeling, you don't get to frighten my son." "Your son?" Dominic's laugh was bitter, broken. Is that what we're calling him? Your son? Not ours? He finally looked up, and Emma saw something in his expression she'd never witnessed before. Genuine emotion, raw and uncontrolled. Did you know? When you applied here, when you've been working under my supervision for 18 months, did you know who I was? The accusation hung between them, sharp and cutting. Emma felt Matteo trembling against her, felt the weight of 8 years of secrets pressing down on her shoulders. Of course I knew, she said, lifting her chin despite the tears burning behind her eyes. I've known every single day. Every time you humiliated me, every time you treated me like trash, I knew exactly who you were. I knew you were the man who told me to take care of it when I called to tell you I was pregnant. I knew you were the man who sent $10,000 like I was a problem that could be solved with money. Dominic stood abruptly, his chair rolling back and hitting the window with a dull thud. He paced to the glass, his hands pressed against it as if he might fall without its support. Beyond him, Seattle sprawled in afternoon sunlight, oblivious to the drama unfolding in this temperature-controlled room. I was 26 years old, he said, his voice tight. I was in business school. My father had just handed me my first real responsibility in the company. I wasn't ready for... He stopped, his jaw working. You should have told me you kept it. Him. You should have told me. Why? Emma's voice cracked. So you could offer me more money? So you could pressure me to give him up for adoption? You made your choice 9 years ago, Dominic. You chose your career, your family's approval, your comfortable future. I chose my son. Matteo pulled away from Emma, his young face serious beyond his years. He walked toward Dominic with the fearless curiosity of a child who hadn't yet learned that some adults were dangerous. Are you really my dad? He asked, his voice small but steady. Dominic turned from the window. Emma watched him look at Matteo, really look at him for the first time. She saw the moment recognition truly landed, when the abstract concept of a child became this specific boy with scraped knees and a superhero backpack, with eyes that mirrored his own. I don't know, Dominic said finally, and Emma heard something crack in his voice. I don't know what I am. The honesty was startling, more unsettling than his anger had been. Matteo considered this answer with the seriousness of someone twice his age. The man at school said you were my father. He had pictures. Matteo reached into his backpack again and pulled out several photographs, laying them on the desk with careful precision. See? This is you when you were little. And this is you and my mom. He said you met at a beach. Emma's breath caught. She recognized the photos immediately, snapshots from that summer, images she'd thought were lost to time. There she was, young and laughing, her hair wild from ocean wind. And Dominic beside her, his arm around her waist, looking at her like she was the center of his universe. How had Victor gotten these? How long had he known? Dominic picked up one of the photographs with trembling fingers, his expression transforming into something Emma couldn't quite read. Memory, perhaps. Or regret. Or the terrible recognition of a past that refused to stay buried. Why now? Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Why would your father do this now after all these years? Dominic looked up from the photograph, and for just a moment, Emma saw the boy from the beach. The one who'd talked about changing the world, about building something meaningful, before power and privilege had calcified around his heart like armor. Because he's dying, Dominic said simply. And apparently he's decided to redistribute his legacy before he goes. The office had become a pressure chamber, the air thick with revelations that rewrote history with every passing second. Emma felt dizzy, her grip on Matteo's shoulder the only thing anchoring her to reality. Victor Hartwell was dying. The man who'd built an empire, who'd shaped Dominic into the ruthless executor of his vision, was dying, and somehow in his final act he'd decided to acknowledge the grandson he'd never met. "What does the letter say?" Emma asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know. Dominic's eyes moved to Matteo, then back to Emma. "Not here. Not in front of—" He stopped himself, the word him dying on his lips as he recognized its inadequacy. Not in front of Matteo. It was the first time he'd spoken his son's name, and the sound of it seemed to surprise them both. Matteo straightened slightly, responding to the acknowledgement with the instinctive hope of a child who'd spent 7 years wondering about the empty space where a father should have been. "I want to know," Matteo said, his small voice carrying unexpected steel. "He's my grandfather. If he's dying, I should know what he wanted to tell me." Emma's heart broke at the maturity in her son's voice, at the way trauma and absence had forced him to grow up faster than any child should. She knelt beside him, her hands framing his face. "Baby, this is adult stuff, complicated stuff." "I'm not a baby," Matteo said, not unkindly. "Mom, you work so hard, you're always tired. Maybe this could help us." The simple pragmatism of his observation gutted Emma. How many nights had he been aware of her exhaustion? How many times had he noticed her counting bills at the kitchen table, heard her crying quietly in the bathroom when she thought he was asleep? Dominic moved to his desk and pressed the intercom. "Margaret, clear my schedule for the afternoon. No interruptions." He released the button and looked at Emma with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "We need to talk, really talk, but not here." "20 minutes later, they sat in Dominic's penthouse apartment in a building that overlooked Elliott Bay. The space was exactly what Emma had imagined, all clean lines and expensive minimalism, more magazine spread than home. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the city that made her feel like they were floating above the world that governed ordinary people's lives. Matteo stood at the window, his small hands pressed against the glass, his eyes wide with wonder. "Mom, you can see everything from here." Emma sat on a leather couch that probably cost more than her car, her hands folded in her lap to stop them from shaking. Dominic poured himself a drink from a crystal decanter, then seemed to think better of it and set the glass down untouched. "My father is 73, he began, still standing, still unable to settle into the vulnerability that this conversation required. 3 months ago, he was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctors gave him 6 months, maybe less." Emma absorbed this information, trying to summon sympathy for a man she'd never met, a man who'd shaped the person who'd broken her heart and abandoned their child. She found the emotion difficult to access. "He's been investigating," Dominic continued, "hiring private detectives, reconstructing my past. Apparently, he doesn't trust me to manage the family legacy appropriately." The bitterness in his voice was palpable. "The letter explains that he's been watching you both for months. He knows where you live, where Matteo goes to school, your financial situation, everything." A chill ran down Emma's spine. The idea of being surveilled, of her private struggles being documented and analyzed by strangers in service of some dying man's agenda, made her feel violated. "Why?" she asked. "What does he want?" Dominic finally sat, but on a chair across from her rather than beside her, maintaining distance even as they navigated this impossible situation. "He wants Matteo acknowledged, legally, publicly. He's written him into his will, 20% of the estate, to be held in trust until he's 25. The numbers were incomprehensible. 20% of the Hartwell fortune was more money than Emma could conceptualize, generational wealth that could transform not just Mateo's life, but the lives of his children and their children after them. "And what does he want in return?" Emma asked, because she knew enough about people like Victor Hartwell to understand that nothing came without strings. DNA test to confirm paternity, legal acknowledgement, and Dominic paused, his jaw tight. He wants Mateo to take the Hartwell name. "Not as a replacement for yours, but as a legal addition. Mateo Reyes Hartwell." Emma's head spun. She looked at her son, still entranced by the view, oblivious to the negotiation happening over his identity, his future, his place in a world that had rejected his existence until a dying man decided to rewrite the rules. "No," she said simply. Dominic blinked. "No?" "No." Emma stood, her legs shaky, but her resolve hardening. "Your father doesn't get to swoop in and claim my son like he's a collector's item. He doesn't get to buy his way into Mateo's life with money and expectations, and neither do you. Emma, this is 20% of— I don't care if it's 100%. Her voice rose, years of suppressed rage finally finding its outlet. "Money doesn't make you a father. Acknowledgement doesn't erase abandonment. You don't get to skip the hard parts, the sleepless nights, the medical emergencies, the times I had to choose between rent and medicine, and jump straight to being family because some piece of paper says you should be." Mateo turned from the window, his expression worried. "Mom, are you okay?" Emma forced herself to breathe, to moderate her tone. "I'm fine, baby. Come here." He crossed to her, and she pulled him close, her anchor in a storm that threatened to sweep them all away. Dominic watched them with an expression that might have been longing, or might have been loss. Emma couldn't tell anymore. "What if I want it?" Mateo's voice was small. "What if I want to know my grandfather? What if I want to be a Hartwell?" The question shattered something in Emma's chest. She looked down at her son, at the hope and confusion warring in his young face, and realized with terrible clarity that this decision couldn't be hers alone anymore. "Then we'll figure it out together," she said softly, her hand stroking his hair. "But slowly, carefully, not because anyone is dying or demanding or trying to control us, because it's what's right for you." She looked up at Dominic, who sat frozen in his chair, watching them with an intensity that felt almost desperate. "If you want to be part of his life," Emma said, "you'll do it right. No shortcuts, no grand gestures. You'll show up consistently, even when it's inconvenient. You'll earn his trust instead of demanding it. And you'll respect that I'm his mother, that I've been here every single day, and that doesn't change no matter what your father's will says." Dominic's throat worked, his eyes bright with something that might have been tears if men like him allowed themselves such vulnerability. "And if I can't? If I don't know how?" Emma's smile was sad, weighted with all the years between them. "Then you'll learn, or you'll leave. Those are the only options." The sun was setting over Elliott Bay, painting the water in shades of amber and rose that seemed too beautiful for the conversation unfolding in Dominic's sterile apartment. Mateo had fallen asleep on the couch, exhausted by the emotional weight of a day that had rewritten the architecture of his young life. Emma sat beside him, one hand resting on his back, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. Dominic stood at the window where Mateo had stood earlier, his reflection ghostly in the darkening glass. For a long time, neither adult spoke, the silence between them filled with 8 years of unasked questions and unspoken accusations. "I need to tell you something," Dominic said finally, his voice so quiet Emma had to strain to hear it. about why I sent that money, about why I disappeared. Emma wanted to tell him she didn't care, that his explanations came too late to matter. But she found herself listening despite her resistance, despite knowing that understanding him might make it harder to hold on to the anger that had sustained her through the hardest years. "My mother left when I was 10, Dominic began, still facing the window, unable or unwilling to meet her eyes. "Just walked out one morning while my father was at work and I was at school. No note, no explanation. We found out later she'd been having an affair with someone. It doesn't matter who. She chose him over us, over me, and she never looked back." He paused, his hand pressed flat against the glass. "My father became different after that, harder. He told me that weakness was a choice, that love was a luxury for people who couldn't afford strength. He built me into what he needed, someone who could protect the family legacy, who would never be vulnerable enough to be abandoned again." Emma felt something shift in her chest, a reluctant empathy she didn't want to feel. She thought about the boy in those beach photographs, the one who'd quoted Rilke and talked about consciousness with genuine wonder. She'd always wondered what had happened to him. "When you told me you were pregnant," Dominic continued, his voice catching, "I panicked. Not because I didn't care. God, Emma, I cared so much it terrified me. But I could hear my father's voice in my head, telling me that sentimentality would destroy everything he'd built. That I had to choose between being strong and being weak. And you chose strength," Emma said, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "I chose fear," Dominic corrected, finally turning to face her. In the dying light, he looked older than his 38 years, worn down by the weight of choices that had seemed inevitable at the time. "I convinced myself I was being practical, making the smart decision. But really, I was just a coward who couldn't imagine being more than what my father had made me." He moved to a chair across from her, sitting heavily, his expensive suit rumpled from a day that had demolished the careful order of his life. "I've spent 9 years becoming everything he wanted, ruthless, successful, untouchable, and I've been absolutely miserable." Emma wanted to take satisfaction in his confession, wanted to feel vindicated by his misery. Instead, she just felt tired, bone-deep exhausted by the waste of it all, by the years they'd lost to fear and pride. "Why didn't you recognize me?" The question had haunted her for 18 months. "When I started working at Hartwell Industries, when you saw me every day, how did you not know?" Dominic's laugh was hollow. "I did. Not immediately, but about 3 months in. You were presenting quarterly projections in a meeting, and you made this gesture with your hand." He demonstrated a small wave that dismissed complexity. "And suddenly, I was back on that beach, listening to you explain why you thought consciousness was an emergent property rather than a fundamental force." Emma remembered that conversation, remembered the way the moonlight had caught in his hair, the way he'd looked at her like she'd unlocked some secret he'd been searching for his whole life. "But you didn't say anything," she whispered. "No." He met her eyes, and she saw shame there, raw and honest. "Because acknowledging you meant acknowledging what I'd done. And I wasn't ready to face that. So I told myself you were just someone who looked like her, like you. I told myself the resemblance was coincidence, and then I made your life hell because seeing you every day was a reminder of my worst failure." "I wasn't a failure," Emma said, her voice sharp. "Mateo isn't a failure. We're people, Dominic. Human beings whose lives matter regardless of how inconvenient we are for your narrative. I know. His voice broke on the words. I know that now. Seeing him today, seeing his face. He stopped, pressing his palms against his eyes as if he could hold back tears through sheer force of will. He has my eyes, my mother's smile. And when he asked if I was his father, I wanted to say yes so badly, but I didn't know how, because I haven't earned the title. I haven't done anything to deserve it. Matteo stirred in his sleep, his small face scrunching up before relaxing again. Emma stroked his hair gently, her touch automatic, born of years of practice. Your father's will, she said. Does it have conditions? Strings attached? Dominic nodded. The DNA test, public acknowledgement, and one more thing. He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. He wants Matteo to spend time at the family estate. Regular visits, supervised by my father while he's still alive. He says it's important for Matteo to understand the family he's inheriting. Emma's protective instincts flared immediately. Absolutely not. I don't care how much money is involved. I'm not handing my son over to a dying stranger who's trying to manipulate us all from beyond the grave. I'm not asking you to, Dominic said quickly. I'm just telling you what the will says. But Emma, there's something else you should know. My father's illness, it's not just affecting his body. He's been having lucid moments mixed with periods of confusion. His doctors aren't sure how much longer his mind will hold. The implication hung between them. Victor Hartwell's intervention, his sudden desire to acknowledge Matteo and redistribute his legacy, might be less about justice and more about the unpredictable firing of a dying brain. Then we wait, Emma said firmly. We get the DNA test done, not because I need proof, but because Matteo might want that certainty someday. We acknowledge paternity legally to protect Matteo's rights. But everything else, the name change, the family visits, the inheritance decisions, we table until we all have time to process this without a ticking clock over our heads. Dominic looked like he might argue, but then something shifted in his expression. He nodded slowly, accepting her boundary, perhaps for the first time in his life, deferring to someone else's authority. Can I? He stopped, started again. Could I spend time with him? Not today. He's exhausted. But soon. I don't know how to be a father, but I'd like to learn. If you'll let me. Emma looked at her sleeping son, at the boy who'd asked her 1,000 questions about his father, who'd drawn pictures of families that always included an empty space where a dad should be. She thought about the anger she'd carried for 8 years, the way it had kept her warm through the coldest nights, but had also calcified around her heart like scar tissue. You'll have to prove yourself, she said finally. Not to me. I don't care what you do for me. But to him. You'll show up when you say you will. You'll be patient with his questions. You'll let him see you as a real person, not some fantasy father he's built in his imagination. And the first time you hurt him, the first time you let him down or disappoint him or make him feel like he's not enough, you'll never let me near him again, Dominic finished. I understand. Emma stood carefully, not wanting to wake Matteo, but needing to establish physical authority in this conversation. She crossed to where Dominic sat and looked down at him with eyes that had seen too much struggle to be easily impressed by repentance. Don't make me regret this, she said quietly. Because if you break his heart the way you broke mine, there won't be enough money in your father's estate to make me forgive you. Dominic stood as well, and for a moment they faced each other across the wreckage of their shared past. Then, with infinite gentleness, he reached out and touched her hand. Just a brief contact, barely a second, but enough to communicate something words couldn't carry. "Thank you," he whispered, "for keeping him, for raising him, for being strong enough for both of us." Emma pulled her hand away, but not unkindly. She returned to the couch and gently woke Matteo, who blinked up at her with sleepy confusion. "Come on, baby, let's go home." As they prepared to leave, Matteo looked back at Dominic with an expression of hopeful curiosity. "Will I see you again?" Dominic knelt down, bringing himself to Matteo's eye level. Up close, the resemblance was undeniable, the same dark blue eyes, the same stubborn set to the jaw. "If that's okay with you," Dominic said carefully, "I'd like that very much." Matteo considered this with the seriousness of someone weighing a life-changing decision. Then he nodded, satisfied, and took Emma's hand. They left Dominic standing in his expensive apartment, surrounded by all the trappings of success that hadn't brought him happiness, alone with the ghost of the man he might have been, and the faint hope of the man he still might become. The DNA test came back 2 weeks later, confirming what everyone already knew. Matteo Reyes was legally, biologically, undeniably Dominic Hartwell's son. The document sat on Emma's kitchen table like a passport to a future she still wasn't sure she wanted. Dominic had been true to his word. He showed up every Saturday morning at 9, arriving in jeans instead of suits, his expensive car parked awkwardly in front of their modest apartment complex. He took Matteo to the Science Museum, to the aquarium, to Pike Place Market, where they watched fish fly through the air and ate warm donuts that left powdered sugar on their faces. Emma watched from a distance, her heart a complicated knot of emotions. She saw Matteo bloom under the attention, saw him gain confidence from having a father who showed up, who listened, who didn't flinch when he asked difficult questions about why they'd been apart. "He wants to know everything," Dominic told her one afternoon, standing in her doorway while Matteo washed his hands inside. "About me? About you? About why I wasn't there? I don't know how to explain it without making myself the villain." "Then be the villain," Emma said quietly. "He deserves the truth, even when it's ugly. Especially when it's ugly." Victor Hartwell passed away on a Tuesday morning in October, surrounded by nurses instead of family. Dominic had tried to arrange a meeting between grandfather and grandson, but Victor's mind had deteriorated too quickly, his lucid moments becoming rare and then non-existent. At the funeral, Matteo wore his first suit, bought by Dominic, tailored to fit his small frame. He held Emma's hand throughout the service, occasionally looking up at the father he was still learning to understand. The Hartwell family watched with barely concealed curiosity, their whispers following Emma like ghosts. She didn't care. Let them whisper, let them judge. She'd survived worse than their disapproval. The will reading happened in a law office that smelled like old leather and older money. Matteo sat between Emma and Dominic, his legs swinging slightly, not quite understanding the magnitude of what was being discussed. 20% of the Hartwell estate, stocks, properties, investments that would generate income for generations. But Victor's will contained one final surprise. A letter to be read aloud, addressed to Dominic. "My son," the lawyer read in a steady voice, "I've spent my life building an empire and destroying the parts of you that made you human. I thought I was teaching you strength, but I was really teaching you fear. Emma Reyes showed more courage in keeping your son than you showed in abandoning him. Learn from her. Learn from the boy. It's not too late to become the man you were meant to be before I broke you." Dominic's hands trembled in his lap. Emma watched a tear slide down his cheek, the first she'd ever seen him shed. The months that followed were messy, complicated, and real. Dominic stumbled often, his instincts warring with his intentions. He missed a soccer game because of work, and Matteo cried. He criticized Emma's parenting during an argument, and she asked him to leave. He tried to buy Matteo's affection with expensive gifts, and Emma had to explain that presence mattered more than presence. But he kept showing up. Through the mistakes and the awkwardness and the painful learning curve of becoming a father to a child who'd already lived 8 years without him, Emma watched him transform slowly, saw the corporate shark give way to something more human. He laughed more. He asked for help instead of pretending he had all the answers. One evening, after putting Matteo to bed, they sat together on Emma's worn couch, the same one where she'd once spread bills and wondered how she'd survive another month. "Thank you," Dominic said quietly, "for giving me a chance I didn't deserve." Emma looked at him, at the man who'd broken her heart and was slowly earning her forgiveness through relentless, imperfect effort. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "This is a lifetime commitment. You don't get to quit when it gets hard." "I know." He met her eyes. "I'm ready." 2 years passed like pages turning in a book, each day writing a new story over the painful chapters that came before. Dominic sold his penthouse and bought a house in Emma's neighborhood, close enough to be present, but separate enough to respect boundaries. He learned to cook Matteo's favorite meals, to help with homework without taking over, to sit quietly during baseball games even when his son struck out. Emma went back to school, using part of Matteo's trust fund to finally pursue the degree she'd abandoned when she got pregnant. Dominic offered to pay, but she insisted on using resources designated for their son's future, because investing in her was investing in Matteo too. The Hartwell Industries culture began to shift. Dominic implemented policies for working parents, flexible schedules, on-site childcare. He promoted Emma to senior analyst, then manager, not because of their connection, but because she was brilliant and he'd been too blind to see it. On a Saturday morning in spring, the three of them stood at Cary Park, overlooking the city where their separate stories had finally converged. Matteo, now 9, stood between them, holding both their hands. "Do you think Grandpa Victor knew?" Matteo asked, his voice thoughtful. "That bringing us together would work?" Dominic and Emma exchanged glances over their son's head, their expressions carrying the weight of shared history and tentative hope. "I think," Emma said carefully, "he gave us a chance. What we did with it was up to us." Dominic squeezed Matteo's hand gently. "And we're still figuring it out, every day." They weren't a traditional family. Emma and Dominic hadn't magically fallen back in love. Too much pain stood between them for easy reconciliation. But they'd built something stronger than romance: respect, partnership, and shared commitment to the boy who'd forced them both to become better than they'd been. Matteo looked up at his mother, then his father, his young face serious. "I'm glad he found me, even if it was complicated, even if it hurt at first." Emma felt tears prick her eyes. She thought about that terrified 23-year-old girl on a beach, about all the years of struggle and shame, and wondering if she'd made the right choice. She thought about the grandmother who'd taught her that survival wasn't just about enduring, but about maintaining your humanity. "Me too, baby," she whispered. "Me too." Below them, Seattle sprawled in morning light, a city of second chances and reinvention, where broken things could be slowly pieced back together if you were willing to do the work. Dominic had transformed Hartwell Industries, but more importantly, he'd transformed himself. Emma had found her voice and her worth. And Matteo had gained not just an inheritance, but something more valuable: a father who was learning, day by day, to be present. The wind carried the scent of cherry blossoms from nearby trees, spring asserting itself after a long, gray winter. Emma closed her eyes and felt the sun on her face, felt her son's hand in hers, and allowed herself something she hadn't felt in years: peace. Not the peace of having all the answers, but the peace of knowing that some questions don't need immediate resolution, that families could be built from wreckage, that forgiveness was a process, not a destination. That love, real love, was choosing to show up again and again, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. As they walked back to the car, Matteo between them chattering about the science project due Monday, Emma caught Dominic's eye. He smiled, tentative, genuine, still learning how to be happy without armor. She smiled back, and in that simple exchange was the promise of a future none of them could have predicted, but all of them were building together, one imperfect day at a time.